The chemistry lab was humming with the typical chatter of teenagers. Their voices filled the room, a mix of nervous laughter, idle gossip, and the clinking of glass beakers. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals, and the usual humdrum of the classroom provided a comfortable background for a Thursday morning. But then, in an instant, everything changed. A single scream broke the air. A gasp from one of the students. The clattering of glass reverberated through the room as Jason Bryant, a senior who owned the halls of Westwood High, lunged forward. His face twisted with rage. His hand shot out like a vice, seizing Sara Hills, the new chemistry teacher, by the throat. Sarah's body slammed into the lab counter with such force that several glass beakers rattled. The students froze, some too terrified to even scream, others fumbling for their phones, too shocked to move. In that moment it felt like time itself had come to a halt. Jason's grip was tight, cruel, and filled with a sense of arrogance. He sneered at her as he pressed her harder against the cold metal surface. His voice was low, dangerous, almost mocking, as if he believed he held all the power in the room. "Thought you could control me, huh?" he spat. "I don't think so, Miss Hills. Not today." The room was thick with tension, a suffocating silence hanging in the air, broken only by the sound of his breathing and the distant hum of the school's fluorescent lights. Every student's eyes were wide, glued to the spectacle unfolding before them. No one had ever dared challenge Jason Bryant like this, least of all a teacher. But in the midst of the chaos, Sarah's eyes were cold, unwavering. She stared back at Jason with an intensity that made the blood freeze in his veins. Her pulse remained steady, her face void of fear. Jason's hands shook slightly, and for a brief moment he wondered if she was truly human. What was it about this woman? Why wasn't she screaming, begging for help? Was she scared? No, she wasn't scared. Sara Hills didn't react. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. She was still calm, watching him, studying him. Every breath Jason took felt like it was sinking with hers in some eerie, unsettling way. Jason's grip tightened, and the sound of glass clinking against metal reverberated through the room once more. His friends, standing in the back of the classroom, chuckled nervously. But there was something uneasy in the way their laughs echoed. It wasn't just fear. It was a palpable sense of confusion. They had all seen Jason put other teachers in their place, reduce them to mere shadows of authority. But this was different. And then Sara spoke. "You've crossed the line," she said, her voice eerily calm, like she was lecturing him about the importance of following directions in a lab. Her words hit him like a slap, and for a second, Jason faltered. He looked into her eyes, no trace of panic, no sign of fear, just a cold, hard resolve. In the few seconds that followed, Jason didn't know what hit him. He had been in control. He was the one making the rules. But now he wasn't so sure. Something in her eyes told him that he had made a grave mistake. Something told him that this woman, Sara Hills, wasn't what he had assumed. And suddenly, it didn't feel so much like he was in control anymore. Before Jason Bryant had laid a hand on Sara Hills, she had walked into Westwood High on her first day with nothing more than a quiet determination in her step. She was a new face in a school known for its cliques, bullies, and the unspoken rules that students followed to survive. A woman in her early 30s with sharp, intelligent eyes, Sara had quickly earned a reputation. She wasn't like the other teachers. She wasn't fresh out of college, nor was she past her prime. Sara had been around. She had lived a life that no one at Westwood knew about. A life that left her with a certain sharpness, an unspoken authority. She dressed neatly, always in long sleeves, regardless of the weather, and always carried herself with perfect posture. No one could pin her down. Too strict, too cold, too mysterious. She commanded respect with a glance, not a word. Some students whispered about her past. "She's been to war," they said. "I bet she's a military officer or something." That would explain the way she looks at people like they're not even there. But nobody knew for sure. She hadn't said a word about her past, and that was how she liked it. Then there was Jason Bryant. He was the definition of privileged, the son of one of the wealthiest businessmen in the city. Jason ruled the school with a careless smile, sharp words and fists that got him what he wanted. He was untouchable. He was the student that everyone either feared or admired, depending on who you asked. But the thing about Jason was this: he had no respect for authority. It didn't matter that his teachers tolerated his bullying, or that his friends treated him like a king. No one dared to question his power until Sara Hills. The first time Jason mocked her, she'd stared him down with eyes so cold that it made his stomach twist. It wasn't like the other teachers. She didn't back down, she didn't flinch, she simply carried on with the lesson as though he wasn't even there. And that, more than anything, made him uneasy. It was clear from the moment Jason first laid eyes on Sara that he had decided to make her his next target. He enjoyed the game, the control, the teasing, the humiliation. At first it was small jabs during class, throwing off her lessons with his mocking laughter. But when she didn't react, when she didn't give him the satisfaction of a burst of anger or frustration, he knew he had to escalate things. It started with snide remarks. "You sure that's how chemistry works, Ms. Hills?" he'd say, loud enough for the whole class to hear. "Or are you just guessing like the rest of us?" The students snickered, the tension in the room palpable. It was his usual tactic, to humiliate his teacher and make her lose control in front of the class. But with Sara, it didn't work. She remained calm, cool, collected. She'd simply respond with, "Focus on your experiment, Jason. You're about to make a mistake." And that was it. Jason's friends, watching from the back of the room, snickered behind their hands, but Sara didn't flinch. It was unsettling. The power was always supposed to be his, but this time, it wasn't. The moment Jason launched himself at Sara, everything in the room seemed to slow down. His muscles tensed as he surged forward, grabbing her by the neck with one hand, slamming her against the counter. The cold metal pressed against Sara's back as he shoved her hard, the sound of it ringing through the lab. The class gasped. Some of them fumbled with their phones, trying to capture the scene, others too terrified to move, but Sara didn't scream, she didn't beg. Her eyes were locked onto Jason's, steady and unwavering. And that's when he realized something. He had made a mistake. He might have been stronger than her, but he had no idea who he was up against. Sara's hands moved faster than Jason could react. Her fingers snapped around his wrist with the force of steel, and before he could comprehend what was happening, his arm was twisted in a direction it was never meant to go. Jason cried out, his arrogant grin faltering as pain shot up his arm. He let go of her throat instinctively, stumbling back as his grip weakened. And then, in that instant, Sara spoke, her voice low, deadly, like a soldier who had seen far worse. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Jason's breath hitched. The air in the room was thick with confusion and fear. His smug arrogance was gone, replaced with a dawning realization that the woman he had underestimated was far more than just a teacher. Jason Bryant had always been the kind of person who believed the world owed him something. Born into wealth, he had never known what it meant to struggle. His father, Richard Bryant, was one of the most powerful businessmen in the city, his name synonymous with influence and money. Jason was the heir to that empire, and everyone in his world, whether family, friends, or even teachers, knew it. He was untouchable. At Westwood High, Jason was the king. His physical presence alone was enough to command attention. Tall, muscular, and with a face that seemed always to carry a smug grin. But it wasn't just his size that earned him respect. It was his father's power. Jason knew that no one would dare touch him, whether in the halls, on the football field, or even in the classroom. The teachers tolerated his bad behavior because they feared his father's influence. Students followed him because they feared his wrath. Every day Jason reminded the world that he was untouchable. He pushed weaker students into lockers for fun, mocked anyone who didn't fit into his narrow worldview, and cut corners on tests with the full knowledge that his father's wealth would shield him from consequences. He lived his life with an arrogance that was both entertaining and terrifying to watch. To Jason, the world was a playground, one he could manipulate however he saw fit. However, his attitude wasn't just born out of entitlement. It was the result of years of reinforcement. His father, though distant, instilled in him a belief that wealth and status were the only things that mattered. Jason had internalized this lesson thoroughly. He wasn't just the son of a businessman. He was destined to control the world around him. But there was one person who stood in the way of his complete domination. Sara Hills, the new chemistry teacher, who had arrived at Westwood High just a few months earlier, was not the type to bend to his will. Jason had sized her up quickly. She wasn't like the other teachers, soft, forgiving, willing to turn a blind eye to his behavior. Sara was different. She had an air of authority about her, a quiet strength that unsettled him. Her calm demeanor and the way she held herself made it clear that she wasn't intimidated by him, something Jason was not used to, and that, more than anything, made him curious. He had made a mental note the first time they crossed paths. This woman was going to be his next challenge. He would break her down, humiliate her like all the others. It was the way he exerted his power, mocking those who had no means of fighting back. But Sara had something Jason hadn't counted on, a presence that made him question whether his wealth and arrogance would actually be enough to control her. The first few weeks of Sara Hills' tenure at Westwood High had been an exercise in subtle tension. Jason Bryant, ever the provocateur, had started with small jabs, questioning her credentials, mocking her age, and making snide comments during class. Sara, however, didn't flinch. She simply carried on with the lesson, dismissing his attempts as if they were irrelevant. Jason found this baffling. No one ignored him. Not his classmates, not his teachers. No one had ever dismissed his taunts and insults without breaking. But Sara, she acted as though he wasn't even there. Her calm demeanor, her controlled responses, and the way she didn't let his insults get under her skin drove him mad. At first, Jason thought it was a game. He believed she would crack under pressure, so he ramped up his efforts. During a lecture on chemical reactions, he deliberately interrupted her, making fun of the complexity of her explanation. "I didn't realize we were in a college lecture, Miss Hills," he said loud enough for the entire class to hear. "Are you sure you know what you're talking about? Or are you just making this up as you go along?" The students snickered, glancing between Jason and Sara. Normally, teachers would have stumbled or tried to defend themselves, but Sara just raised an eyebrow. She didn't seem shaken. "Focus on your experiment, Jason," she replied coolly. "You're about to spill your solution." The class fell into an uncomfortable silence. Jason was taken aback, and for a split second the smirk on his face faltered. No one had ever responded to him like that. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she said them, calm, unbothered. It was as though she had just placed him back in his place without raising her voice or even breaking a sweat. Jason's friends, watching from the back of the classroom, exchanged confused glances. What was going on? Why wasn't she reacting? Wasn't she supposed to be intimidated? But Sara remained unfazed. She continued with the lesson, never acknowledging Jason's attempt at provocation. It was this indifference that drove him to his breaking point. He wasn't used to being ignored. His attempts at domination were being deflected with the ease of swatting away a fly, and it infuriated him. Jason's frustration grew with every passing class. He couldn't shake the feeling that Sara was quietly laughing at him. How dare she not acknowledge his power? How dare she not bend to his will like everyone else? In the next chemistry class, Jason decided to escalate things further. It wasn't just about mocking her anymore. This time, he was going to force her to recognize his superiority, to submit to his authority. As the students worked on their lab experiments, Jason leaned back in his chair, staring at Sara. He had been waiting for the right moment to strike, and now, with the classroom buzzing with activity, was the perfect opportunity. He leaned forward, slamming his hands on the desk to get her attention. "Miss Hills," he called out, loud enough for the entire class to hear, "I really hope you know what you're talking about. Chemistry is serious stuff. It's not a place for amateurs, don't you think?" The class fell silent, all eyes turning to Sara. Jason's voice dripped with mockery, his words clearly intended to humiliate her. Sara paused for a moment, her eyes meeting his. The tension in the room thickened, but she didn't blink. She didn't flinch. "Jason, I suggest you focus on your experiment," she said, her voice cold. "You're not the one who's in charge here." The words struck like a dagger. The arrogance that Jason had relied on for years suddenly felt like a hollow echo. His friends snickered nervously in the back of the room, unsure whether they should laugh or be concerned, but Jason's pride wouldn't allow him to back down. With a deep breath, Jason stood up, pushing his chair back with force. He took a few steps towards Sara, standing tall and imposing. His face twisted in a sneer. "You think you can talk to me like that?" His voice was low, filled with venom. "I don't take orders from anyone, especially not some teacher who thinks she can control me." Sara met his gaze with a look that sent a chill through the room. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. "Sit down, Jason," she said. Her voice was calm, but the command in it was undeniable. For a brief moment, Jason hesitated. The students watched in rapt attention, holding their breath. Was he really going to back down? Jason's pride surged within him, and before anyone could blink, he lunged forward, stepping into her personal space. He stood over her, fists clenched at his sides. "What are you going to do about it?" he spat. The classroom was silent. The moment hung heavy in the air, all eyes locked on the two of them. Jason's challenge hung in the air like an unspoken dare. For a moment, no one moved. But then, with a move too quick for most of the students to catch, Jason grabbed Sara by the throat. His grip was strong, fueled by frustration and the need to prove he was still in control. Sara's body slammed into the counter, the sound of metal and glass ringing out through the room. Students gasped, some stumbling backward. Phones came out, recording the chaos. Jason's hand tightened around her neck, but Sara didn't scream. She didn't fight him. Her eyes, however, were locked onto his with a chilling intensity. Jason's smile widened, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes now. For the first time, he wasn't sure whether Sara was afraid of him. She didn't look terrified. She didn't look weak. The class watched in stunned silence, unsure how to react. This wasn't part of the script. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Jason leaned in, his voice low and mocking. "Thought you could control me. Thought you could stand up to me." His words dripped with arrogance, but his grip was starting to falter. Sara's eyes narrowed. There was a shift in the air. Sara's fingers moved, lightning fast, gripping Jason's wrist with an iron-like hold. The class collectively gasped as Jason's smug grin faltered. "What are you?" Jason started to say, but his words were cut off by the searing pain in his arm. Sara didn't yell. She didn't panic. She simply said, in a voice as cold as ice, "You've crossed a line, Jason." The room was silent, except for the sound of Jason's heavy breathing. Every eye was fixed on the scene before them. It wasn't just the sight of a teacher being attacked by a student, it was the sheer audacity of it. Jason Bryant had always been the untouchable one, the kid who could get away with anything because of his wealth and power. But today that illusion was shattering before their eyes. Jason's fingers were wrapped tightly around Sara's throat, his eyes wild with rage. His grip was relentless, his face contorted in pure fury. He was used to having control, used to being the one who held the power in any situation. But here, in the chemistry lab, that control seemed to slip further from his grasp with every passing second. Sara's body slammed into the counter with a sickening thud, the force knocking a few glass beakers loose, which shattered against the floor. But Sara didn't scream. She didn't even twitch in pain. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the classroom suspended in an eerie stillness, broken only by Jason's labored breathing. Jason smirked, his lips curling into a malicious grin. "What are you going to do, Miss Hills?" he sneered, tightening his grip around her throat. "Beg for mercy?" The words stung, but Sara's eyes remained locked on his, as cold and steady as ever. Her face was a mask of calm, unfazed by the pressure against her neck. The class was paralyzed in shock. This wasn't how they had imagined it would go. They had expected Sara to break under the weight of Jason's aggression, to cry out for help, to crumble in front of him, but instead she stood still, her eyes unwavering, her pulse steady. It was like she was waiting for something, poised and ready. And that unnerved Jason. But in his arrogance he didn't care. He was used to people fearing him, and this teacher was no different. His grip tightened further, but as he did, something shifted in the room. There was a quiet, almost imperceptible tension in the air, a thickening sense of dread that none of the students could explain. They watched, unable to tear their eyes away as Jason's confidence wavered. For a brief moment, just as his hand tightened, he noticed something, a shift in Sara's posture. Her shoulders were no longer stiff with defiance. They were relaxed, controlled. Her hands, which had been at her sides, now moved in tiny, deliberate motions, almost too subtle for Jason to notice. Suddenly, in a flash of movement so fast it was almost impossible to track, Sara's left hand shot up, her fingers gripping Jason's wrist with a force that stunned him. He didn't have time to react. His wrist was caught in an iron grip, one that sent a shock of pain through his arm, and the smug grin vanished from his face. The students watched, wide-eyed and breathless, as Sara's hand twisted Jason's wrist with a precision and control that no one could have predicted. Jason let out a strangled cry of surprise and pain, his grip on her throat weakening as his body instinctively tried to pull away, but Sara didn't let go. She didn't even flinch. She had been waiting for this moment. With a sudden twist of her wrist, she forced Jason to release his hold on her neck. The pressure that had been choking the life out of her disappeared in an instant, but she didn't stop there. In one fluid motion, Sara pulled him toward her, using his momentum against him. His feet left the ground for a split second as he was pulled into her space, his body now twisted at an angle that forced him to his knees. The entire class gasped. The bully, Jason Bryant, the invincible student, was now on the floor, on his knees, humiliated by a woman half his size. Sara moved with the grace and precision of someone who had spent years perfecting her control over her body. She didn't act out of anger, only calculated precision. Every motion she made was purposeful, every shift of her weight designed to keep Jason under control. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the panic spreading across his face. Jason scrambled to break free, his hands clawing at her grip, but it was futile. The more he fought, the tighter Sara's hold became. His earlier bravado was slipping away, replaced by genuine fear. This wasn't a teacher he could intimidate. This was something far different. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead as he gasped for air. His pride, his arrogance, everything that had once made him feel untouchable, was now disintegrating before him. Sara leaned in, her face inches from his, her voice low but firm. "You've crossed the line, Jason," she said, her words cold and final. Jason's body tensed as the gravity of the situation settled in. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be powerless, to be completely at the mercy of someone else. He had made the mistake of thinking his wealth, his power, and his father's name could protect him forever. But this was different. Here his money meant nothing. Here he was simply a student, and she was the one in charge. Jason, still on his knees, looked up at Sara, his eyes wide with disbelief. The room was silent except for the sound of his shallow breathing. The students watched in stunned silence, their phones forgotten in their hands. This was no longer a classroom fight. It was an event that would be talked about for years to come. Jason's face flushed red, not from anger, but from humiliation. He had been knocked down in front of his friends, in front of everyone. The bully who had once commanded the respect of the entire school was now a broken mess, at the mercy of a teacher who hadn't even broken a sweat. His mouth opened, but no words came out. His throat was tight with the weight of his pride, the overwhelming realization that he had been utterly defeated. The whispers of his friends grew louder, but none dared intervene. They were too stunned by the scene before them. Sara didn't release him. She kept him pinned, her hands like iron bands. His friends shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to do. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Jason had always been the one in control. He had never been brought low like this. "Say it," Sara commanded, her voice hard, without a trace of emotion. Jason's eyes flickered with fear. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by a terrified submission. Sara didn't respond. She didn't need to. The apology wasn't for her. It was for the humiliation, the power he had lost in front of everyone. The apology was a release for him, the last thread of his pride slipping away. Jason's body went limp as Sara released him. He staggered back, clutching his arm where it still throbbed from the pain. He wasn't a giant anymore. He wasn't untouchable. He was just another kid who had crossed the wrong person, and now he had to live with that. The class remained silent as Jason stumbled backward, trying to regain some semblance of dignity. His friends, still in shock, exchanged looks but didn't dare speak. Jason's defeat was a hard pill to swallow for them, especially knowing that none of them had been brave enough to stand up to him before. Sara stood tall, her posture perfect as always. She didn't move toward Jason, didn't try to console him or make a show of his humiliation. She simply adjusted her blouse as if she were preparing to continue with the lesson, as if nothing had happened. Her calm demeanor was the most frightening thing of all. Jason, his face pale and his body still shaking from the shock of it all, looked at Sara one last time before he backed away and left the room. He had no more words, no more arrogance. He was broken, and everyone in that classroom knew it. Sara watched him leave with an almost imperceptible glance. Her eyes were not filled with satisfaction, but with something colder, something that spoke of her true nature. She had shown him the consequences of underestimating her, and she had done it without a single word of violence, without a shred of emotion. As the door closed behind Jason, the classroom was left in silence. No one dared to speak for several long moments, each student processing the scene they had just witnessed. Some would leave the room with a new respect for their teacher, others would be afraid of her. But one thing was certain. Sara Hills was not someone anyone would challenge again. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Sara calmly returned to the front of the room, as if nothing had happened. She adjusted her glasses, glanced at the clock and said, "Class dismissed." The students filed out of the room, casting furtive glances at each other and at Sara. No one dared to speak, but the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. Jason Bryant, once the king of Westwood High, had been humbled. But what would happen next? How far would he go to avenge his humiliation? Jason walked the hallways of Westwood High as if he were a ghost, a shell of the confident, invincible figure he once was. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by a slow, hesitant shuffle. His head hung low in defeat. Every student he passed seemed to look at him with a mix of pity, curiosity, and a bit of fear. Whispers filled the air, but Jason couldn't quite make sense of the words. All he could hear was the thudding of his own heart in his chest. He had been defeated, publicly, brutally, and no amount of money or influence could change that. His reputation, which had once been the foundation of his power, was crumbling. His friends, who had once followed him blindly, now kept their distance. They could still hardly believe what had happened. Jason had always been the one in control, but now he had been humbled, broken by a woman he had underestimated. Jason's jaw clenched. He was angry, furious. But this was different from the rage he had felt before. This wasn't the blind anger he used to feel when things didn't go his way. No, this was something deeper. His sense of entitlement, his arrogance, had been shattered in an instant, and it was all thanks to Ms. Sara Hills. Jason had never been afraid of anyone, at least, not until now. How could I let this happen? He thought as he reached his locker. His reflection in the metal surface stared back at him, and for the first time in years, Jason didn't recognize the face looking back. It was pale, wide-eyed, and filled with a sense of disbelief. He looked like a kid who had just been stripped of everything he thought made him powerful. His mind raced with thoughts of revenge. He couldn't just let this go. Not after what happened. He had to regain control, regain his reputation. But how? His friends had scattered when he had tried to rally them to his cause, each of them avoiding his gaze as if they were scared of being associated with him. The shame of what happened was spreading like wildfire. Jason's father, who usually bailed him out of any situation, had yet to call him, though Jason had sent a desperate text asking for help. Jason clenched his fists. He couldn't let this stand. He wasn't going to let a teacher of all people take away his power. The next day, Sara entered the classroom with the same calm composure she always had. But today, there was something different in the air. The students who had once viewed her as merely a teacher now saw her through a different lens. She wasn't just the new chemistry instructor anymore. She was a force to be reckoned with. As Sara began her lesson, there was a noticeable change in the atmosphere. Students who had once talked during class now sat in rapt attention. They were still processing what had happened the previous day. News of Jason's humiliation had spread through the school like wildfire, and Sara's strength had taken on a life of its own. The incident in the chemistry lab had been a turning point, not just for Jason but for Sara as well. She had revealed a side of herself no one had seen before. Her hidden strength, her calm authority in the face of violence, and the sheer discipline with which she had neutralized Jason's attack had shaken everyone. Sara didn't gloat about her victory. She didn't need to. The respect she had earned from the students was quiet, yet undeniable. Whispers about her military past started circulating, and while some students speculated about her background, most remained respectful, wondering how a teacher could be so composed under pressure. Some students, however, couldn't help but feel a sense of fear. Sara wasn't just any teacher. She wasn't bound by the typical teacher-student dynamics that kept the bullies in check. She wasn't afraid to stand up to the powerful, and that realization brought a certain level of intimidation with it. Even the teachers were starting to look at her differently. They had always known she was capable. Her calm, authoritative presence had made that clear from the first day. But what happened in the chemistry lab had proved that she was not someone to be trifled with. There was a subtle respect among the staff now, some of them whispering about her as she passed by the teacher's lounge. One teacher, Ms. Walker, who had seen the whole incident unfold from the hallway, even complimented her after class. "You handled yourself well in there, Sara," she said, her tone genuine but slightly wary. "Not many people could have kept their cool like that." Sara merely nodded, offering a polite smile in return. She didn't need validation from anyone. She wasn't in this for approval. She was simply doing her job. But the words carried weight. The respect was no longer just professional, it was personal. The rumors about Sara's past began to spread, first through the students and eventually to the faculty. There were whispers in the teacher's lounge, speculations about her past life before Westwood High. Some teachers were curious, others apprehensive, but none dared to ask her directly. It was Mr. Daniels, a long-time teacher at Westwood, who finally connected the dots. A few days after the incident, he mentioned casually to Ms. Walker, another teacher, that Sara had served in the military. Ms. Walker was taken aback, Military? She asked incredulously. Sara, she doesn't seem like the type. But Mr. Daniels wasn't one to gossip without reason. He had known Sara years ago before she came to teach at Westwood, and he had always suspected there was more to her than met the eye. He had seen her during a professional development seminar years earlier, and her sharp, disciplined attitude had intrigued him. She had kept her distance from the other teachers at first, but there had been something about her that suggested she had lived a life outside the classroom, a life that wasn't so ordinary. When Mr. Daniels mentioned the military, Ms. Walker's eyes widened. "You mean she's ex-military?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Mr. Daniels nodded. "She doesn't talk about it, but it's true. I heard it from someone who used to work with her. She was in special operations, combat training, hand-to-hand, tactical strategy, everything you'd expect from someone who's been on the front lines. She left the military after a few years, but she still carries that discipline with her. That's what made her so formidable in the classroom. She's not just a teacher, she's a soldier." This revelation stunned Ms. Walker. She had always admired Sara's calmness and authority, but the idea that she had been trained for combat added an entirely new dimension to her. It explained how easily Sara had handled Jason's attack. What the students hadn't realized was that she had been trained for far worse situations than a schoolyard bully's tantrum. It wasn't just the physical aspect of her strength. It was the mental toughness, the ability to remain composed under pressure that set her apart, and that was something none of her students or Jason had been prepared for. Jason's mind raced as he sat in his car, parked in the empty lot behind Westwood High. His thoughts were consumed by one thing: revenge. He could still feel the sting of his humiliation in the chemistry lab, and it gnawed at him with every passing minute. He couldn't let Sara get away with what she had done. He needed to regain control, to show everyone that he was still powerful, still the person they all feared. His father had always been his shield, his source of unchallenged power. But this time, even his father's influence wouldn't be enough. Jason had to do this himself. Jason knew that he couldn't just let this go. He had always been the one who controlled the narrative. He was the one who decided who got respect and who didn't. But now, Sara had turned the tables, and that was something he couldn't ignore. The more Jason thought about it, the angrier he became. He couldn't just forget the way Sara had looked at him, the coldness in her eyes when she pinned him to the counter. She had treated him like a child, like he was beneath her. That kind of disrespect couldn't go unanswered. Jason clenched his fists, his heart pounding with the need for retribution. He began to hatch a plan, something that would bring Sara down a notch. Maybe he couldn't beat her physically, but he could destroy her reputation. He could find her weakness. Everyone had one, and expose it. He was going to make her pay for what she had done. The principal sat in his office, his fingers drumming nervously against the wooden desk. The pressure was mounting. He had heard from Jason's father, who had demanded action. Jason had made sure his father knew everything, painting himself as the victim of an unprovoked attack. But the principal knew better. He had seen the footage. He had heard the full account from the students in the classroom. He knew that Sara had acted in self-defense, that her actions were justified. But Jason's father wasn't the kind of man to let things go. The principal picked up the phone and dialed Sara's number. As the line rang, he leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He knew that whatever decision he made would set the tone for the rest of the school year. As Sara answered the phone, the principal's words were deliberate. "Miss Hills, I need to speak with you about the incident." His voice was steady, but there was an underlying tension. Would Sara be able to weather this storm, or would Jason's father succeed in forcing her out of Westwood High? Jason's car engine rumbled as he sat parked in the lot behind Westwood High, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His knuckles were white, and his thoughts were a whirlwind. The image of Sara, calm, unbothered, taking him down in front of everyone, kept playing over and over in his mind. It was humiliating. No matter how many times he tried to replay it in his head, he couldn't shake the feeling of defeat. She had shattered something in him that would never be fixed. Jason leaned forward, resting his head against the steering wheel. He was used to winning. He was used to getting what he wanted, controlling the situation. But this was something different. Sara had broken through his armor in a way no one ever had. He was furious, and that anger had fueled a growing need for revenge. His phone buzzed in the passenger seat, and Jason glanced at it. It was a message from Tom, one of his former close friends. "You good, man?" the message read. Jason scrolled through, hesitating for a moment before replying, "I'm fine. Just need to figure some things out." Jason wasn't fine. He was far from it. The feeling of helplessness gnawed at him. But there was something else too, something in the pit of his stomach. Could he really do this? Could he really take this fight to the next level? He wasn't sure anymore. His father's power had always been the key to his dominance, but Sara had made him realize that no amount of money or threats would fix the damage to his pride. Still, the plan was simple: destroy her reputation, ruin her career, make her pay for the humiliation. Sara wasn't invincible, no matter how calm she seemed. She wasn't untouchable. He would make sure of that. He picked up the phone again, tapping in Tom's number. "We need to talk," Jason muttered as he pressed call. The plan was on, but for the first time, Jason wasn't sure whether it was out of a need for revenge or out of a desperate desire to regain the sense of power he had lost. The day was drawing to a close when Principal Franklin called Sara into his office. She entered the room with the same quiet confidence she always carried, though her mind was on other things. She knew that Jason's father had been pushing for some sort of disciplinary action after the confrontation in the chemistry lab. She was aware of the whispers around school, of the rising tension between her and the administration. But Sara had been through worse. She had faced far more serious challenges during her time in the military. What was a disgruntled parent compared to the threats she had dealt with on the field? "Ms. Hills, thank you for coming in," Principal Franklin greeted her, his tone polite but tinged with something else, something more serious. He gestured for her to sit. "I wanted to talk to you about the incident with Jason Bryant. His father has insisted that we take action, that you be formally reprimanded for—" Sara met his eyes without flinching, sitting up straight in the chair. "I acted in self-defense. I'm sure you have the reports from the students. I didn't initiate the violence." The principal nodded slowly. "I understand that, but you must realize the optics of this. Jason Bryant is a very powerful student in this school. His father is influential, and he's threatening to escalate this further. The school could face a lot of backlash." Sara listened patiently, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had heard this all before, advice from people who were more concerned with politics than what was right. She had no patience for it. "I don't care about politics, Mr. Franklin," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "I came here to teach, not to bow to the powerful. I'm here to ensure these students learn, to create an environment where respect is earned, not forced." The principal took a deep breath, clearly torn. "I understand your position, Ms. Hills, but there's more at play here than just this isolated incident. Jason's father is threatening to remove his son from this school if we don't take action. He's a major donor. This could affect the future of the school if it's not handled carefully." Sara didn't respond immediately. She had been in situations where authority figures had tried to manipulate outcomes based on power. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. "You're asking me to back down because of pressure from someone who's used to getting his way," she said calmly. "But the only lesson here should be that no one is above the rules. Not Jason Bryant, not his father." The silence that followed was thick. Finally, Principal Franklin sighed. "I won't punish you, Sara. Not for doing what's right. But you need to be prepared. This isn't over. Jason's father won't let this go easily, and there will be consequences." Sara stood up, her posture as strong as ever. "I'll handle whatever comes my way," she said simply. "I'm not afraid." As she turned to leave, Principal Franklin's voice stopped her. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" he asked, his voice somber. Sara met his gaze one last time. "I'm ready." Jason sat alone in his room, staring at the screen of his phone. His father had called again, furious that the situation wasn't resolved, demanding that Jason go to Sara and make her pay for what had happened. But Jason was different now. The words his father had spoken seemed to fall flat. He had always sought his approval, tried to live up to the impossible expectations his father set for him. But after everything that had happened, after the humiliation in the chemistry lab, he wasn't sure he could continue this way. His phone buzzed, snapping him from his thoughts. It was a message from Tom. "We're going to take her down. Meet me after school." Jason stared at the message for a long moment, his thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of him wanted to respond, to jump back into the plan and make Sara pay. But another part, the part that was beginning to awaken, hesitated. He thought about the way Sara had handled everything. Calm, composed, unshaken. She hadn't screamed for help. She hadn't begged. She had stood there, and she had shown him something that Jason had never understood before: true power. Jason's hands trembled slightly as he typed back. "I don't know if I want to do this anymore." He stared at the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment, the crossroads. His decision now would determine what kind of person he would become. The next day in class, Sara didn't mention the incident at all. She continued teaching as if nothing had happened, her presence commanding attention without needing to speak of what transpired. But the students knew. They had seen the strength in her, and they had learned the lesson. They knew that respect wasn't something you demanded, it was something you earned through your actions. Jason entered the classroom late, his footsteps slow, hesitant. His friends were nowhere to be found, and the familiar arrogance in his stride had been replaced by something else. He stood there, staring at Sara, unsure of what to say. He had come to a realization over the past few days. His world, built on privilege and power, had crumbled in front of him, and what he had once thought was strength, his father's money, his ability to control people, had only been an illusion. The real strength came from within, something he hadn't understood until now. Sara looked up at him, her gaze steady. She didn't say anything, didn't offer him an opportunity to speak. She simply nodded and continued with her lesson. After a few minutes, Jason cleared his throat. "Miss Hills, I'm sorry. For everything. I shouldn't have done what I did." Sara didn't smile. She didn't need to. The apology was enough, and in that moment, Jason's humility spoke louder than any action he could have taken. "I appreciate that," Sara said quietly, without fanfare. "But actions speak louder than words. Learn from this." Jason nodded, his eyes downcast. As he walked back to his seat, the students watched him. There were no whispers, no judgments. They understood. It wasn't about his apology. It was about his growth. And for the first time, Jason felt something he had never felt before, the weight of true respect. As Sara walked away from the school, her mind wandered to the events that had unfolded over the past few days. The lesson she had hoped to impart wasn't just about physical strength or the ability to defend oneself in a moment of violence. It was about something deeper. Something that transcended money, power, and arrogance. In the end, it was clear to her. True power does not come from wealth or status. No amount of money can buy respect. Respect is earned through your actions, your integrity, and the way you treat others. The world might try to convince you that power is measured by how much you control or how much you have, but the reality is different. For Jason Bryant, the lesson came too late, but it was a lesson nonetheless. His wealth, his father's influence, it all meant nothing when faced with someone who had no fear and no need for validation. No matter how much money you have, it can't protect you from the consequences of your actions. Arrogance blinds you to the truth, and that's a dangerous thing. You may walk through life thinking you're untouchable, but in the end it's your character that defines you, not your bank account or your name. As Sara stood at the school gates watching the students leave, she knew that her job wasn't just to teach chemistry, it was to shape their character. It was to remind them that being kind, humble, and strong in character will always be more powerful than any display of arrogance or wealth. Thank you for watching this story. If you've enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe to Black Voice Matters for more incredible stories like this one.